Good afternoon. Let's start with the questions asked for the previous lecture. Question 1. If monarchies are built according to the same mechanism that is embodied in the leader cells, and if there is objectively a leader of the leaders, in what is he, except for secrecy, inferior in governance in relation to virtual structures? Second, if the form of the announcement helps to strengthen what needs to leave from life, is it worth posing the question on the grammatically correct form of expressions? Let's start with the fact that analogies are not proof. Analogies are illustrations of some phenomena, some processes that are difficult to directly perceive, especially through the human senses. Some other processes that flow with approximately similar cause-effect relationships can give a view on how processes flow that are inaccessible to direct perception. For an analogy to become an illustration, it is necessary to develop such a direction of science as the similarity theory. Airplanes and ships are designed on the basis of the similarity theory. The similarity theory of hydroaerodynamics is the basis for designing airplanes and ships. Hence, in the 1950s, when digital computing technology was at a rather low level of development and did not enable one to solve many tasks by numerical analyses, many tasks of hydroaerodynamics were solved on analog machines. The principle was simple. A certain electronic scheme was built, voltage was applied to it, and the processes in this electronic scheme were described by the same mathematical equations that described the movement of the airplane or ship. And if you recorded the output processes from this electronic scheme onto an oscilloscope, then within a few minutes or seconds, you could get an idea of how a ship or an airplane would behave in certain circumstances, what changes had to be made to the construction in order to make a good technical object. Therefore, the question about the leader cells, about the leaders of leaders, it has nothing to do with how governance is organized in the monarchy. If we talk about the monarchy as such, then the monarchy is rather a cultural superstructure over the herd-pack instincts of the herd-pack monkey of the biological species Homo sapiens, and everything else is a bow on the side. Of course, there are also some socio-culturally conditioned additions to instinctive programs, but still, at the core, it is a division according to psychotypes that exist when building a herd or a pack in the biosphere. Therefore, questions about monarchies are another theme, and when we get to the theme of state governance, how the entire function of governance is implemented in various types of statehood, this will be shown. The second part of the question. If the form of the announcement helps to strengthen what should leave from life, is it worth posing the question on the grammatically correct form of expressions? The question of the grammatically correct form of expressions, and in fact about the accuracy of word usage, the correct order of words in sentences, the interconnections in a sentence, should always be posed. In fact, we live in a culture where it is believed that mathematics is an extremely strict system, and if you read a certain mathematical text, then it should be read until the first mistake. If you find the first mistake, then all the following doesn't have to be read, because all the following will to a greater or lesser extent be a consequence of this error. There is almost the same attitude towards music. So you sing something somewhere, in one part you sing it falsely, and then it goes on in this vein. In fact, everything seems to be more or less fine. The rest of the performance is acceptable, gives you some pleasure, and does not annoy the listeners. And it is believed that the culture of speech is in the last place in terms of accuracy of using all the tools that a particular language provides to a person. But it turns out that this is not true. In reality, we have repeatedly had to come across the fact that a text that is written up to page 250 or so suddenly stops and ceases narrating itself. What to do after that? There are two variants. Either by the method of pushing yourself forward, you somehow continue this text, or you start reading it from beginning to end, slowly weighing every word. And in the preponderance of cases, it turns out that somewhere on page 10 or page 20 maybe, there was a not quite accurate usage of a word. And it is the inaccuracy of word usage somewhere at the very beginning of the text that blocks further presentation, because the inaccuracy of word usage there does not allow revealing some meanings on page 200 and something. Therefore, first of all, one must understand that articulate speech is not a means of exchanging information between us. Articulate speech as a means of exchanging information between us is not the first level of importance of articulate speech. Its main purpose is to govern the course of the process in life in the mode of life utterance. As one says, so it will be. But this requires a certain culture of word usage, accuracy of word usage, grammatically correct construction of the phrases, careful usage of similar sounding words, and a tuning that transfers the process from your inner world into the common to all of us world. Question 2. It was very interesting to read the story of Ivan Yefremov, The Heart of the Serpent. It considers the biological aspect of the interaction of different human civilizations. People from different planets. People from Earth have physiology, oxygen, and people from the other planet, fluorine, which makes their direct contact impossible. They have to contact through an airtight partition, and each side had an atmosphere of its own in terms of gas composition. The truth says that science fiction writers, if they consider the contacts of terrestrial civilization with civilizations of other biological species, do not touch upon the questions of biological differences, but only the social aspects of interaction. But for some reason I recalled. Yes, indeed, Ivan Antonovich is one of the few science fiction writers who, in the form of science fiction plots, in general, proposed very life-important problems for consideration. Ivan Antonovich is one of the few who considered the question of the conditionality of culture, the ways of its development, the biology of the carrier of this culture, the biology of the species of the builder of a certain civilization. But hardly any other science fiction writers have addressed this theme. So for the attraction of the plot, sometimes simply human psychology is transferred onto the biobasis of some monster, and then the plots are constructed. Question 3. Why do girls choose and build relationships with so-called hooligans, and what do ordinary guys have to do? Girls choose to build relationships with so-called hooligans because they have not grown up to the human type of psyche structure, but have stopped in their personality development somewhere earlier. And when they find themselves under the power of herd pack instincts and reproductive instincts, they orient themselves on the coolest male in the pack. This is why they build relationships with hooligans. Further, since, after all, human society lives in conditions of civilization, such a choice often breaks the fate of both hooligans and those who choose them. But in order for such things not to happen, fathers and mothers need to take care that both boys and girls do not grow up as banderlogs. But by the age of 13, 14, they clearly understand what the difference is between a human and a banderlog, and by the efforts of their own will, they dobro-sovestiously strive to be humans. In this case, the problem will disappear. The second half of the question. What do ordinary guys have to do? First of all, ordinary guys should not follow their own instincts and should rise to the level of what is called a taken-place human. When a person has become a taken-place human, then he ceases to be a slave of sexual instincts. He is always emotionally self-sufficient, positively self-sufficient, and in this case, what is commonly called freedom of love opens, without understanding what freedom of love in life really means. By the words freedom of love, hippieism, as a right to have sex with anyone, is understood. This is not freedom of love. It is all permissiveness, sexual licentiousness. Its reasons may be different, but the main one is that a person has not become a taken-place human. And freedom of love, it is expressed in something different. You can love anyone you want, but after you have made your choice, and that choice is accepted by the other side, there is no turning back from that moment. From that moment, even if you are betrayed, and the other side commits adultery, you are still obliged to show love towards this person, not in the sense of attachment, forgiveness, a rollback of the situation into the past, but in the sense that love, it does not go away. And the person who once found himself in your area of responsibility, he remains in this area of responsibility until the end of his days, or until the end of your days. And love is expressed in the fact that it, one way or another, helps another person to solve his problems. Not just to solve his problems, however, but to solve his problems in the process of his personal development. Because if you just compensate for this or that damage that he does to himself, then you are not contributing to his personal development. And if you contribute to his personal development, then the damage that he inflicts on himself, or that circumstances inflict on him, due to the fact that he goes beyond the boundaries of God's allowance. This damage will be compensated in some way with your help, without your help, but the main thing is that the person will develop as a personality in the direction of achieving the human type of psyche structure. Therefore, an ordinary person can choose someone. If he is answered, then he just needs to love. And it will be much better than to achieve condescension from a beautifully painted doll. Question 4. It is even better to start with the spirit. The mind often refuses to serve the human animal. Yes, you are right. It is necessary to begin with the building of a human type of psyche structure. But in order to build a human type of psyche structure, a zombie, a bandalog, a demon must understand that he is not a taken-place human. And besides, he must understand that it is wrong to live as he lives. Therefore, a certain minimum of reason is required for such a mode, which enables one to understand these two circumstances, and then reach the path of personal development in order to become a human. And while this has not taken place, many ambitions of the bandalog are unrealizable because they are denied from above in acquiring distinction. And their reason works in any random fashion, but not as it should work, to the maximum. Therefore, intellectual power is limited and does not allow solving the tasks that the individual is trying to pose and solve. Question 5. Viktor Yefimov voiced several times that young people need to be involved in governance. It is very difficult to interest them. What methods are most successful? Firstly, Viktor Yefimov did not voice it, but announced it. You see, more successful methods do not exist, because you can, communicating with a person, understand what type he belongs to on the basis of the typology of the types of psyche structure. You can understand what type he belongs to according to P.F. Lesgaft's typology, which he outlined in his book, Family Upbringing of a Child and Its Meaning. Moreover, these two typologies are interconnected, because in relation to the adult, the typology of the types of psyche structure is basic, and the typology of Lesgaft is a superstructure. Superstructure for the simple reason that the types of character that Lesgaft shows are not all compatible with the types of psyche structure. There are types of psyche structure that cannot continue only as a normal according to Lesgaft type. And there are types of character according to Lesgaft which can basically have only certain non-human types of psyche structure. What's more, not all of them either. Then again, it turns out that you cannot want for another person. You cannot tell him to want to become a human. Therefore, the maximum you can do is to broaden the individual's horizons, show him some situations in which he could become better, open some perspectives for his future life if he behaves this way. Besides, you should show him perspectives not in the oracle mode, that your future will be so and that's all. This has been a trap since the time of the ancient Greeks. In Greek tragedies, there was often the theme of the individual and fate, that is, destiny. An example is King Oedipus. The trap is that in order to change the further course of events in one's own life, the process of inscription of himself into the circumstances of life, one needs to change oneself. If you are shown that the future will be like this, and it is conditioned by the fact that you are such and such, and the future will be different if you change yourself, but only you can change yourself, then this problem will be solved. But this problem is always solved in every individual case, concretely, because every person has his own mistakes in the building of the psyche, his own peculiarities of worldview, his own mistakes of world understanding. Question 6. And an even more important question, women are generally unapproachable. They are not interested in all of this. How can they be involved in this work? Yes, the psychology of girls, women, little girls is not the same as the psychology of boys, men, little boys. They have a different way of world perception, a different way of comprehending. So you just need to build relationships, develop skills to feel what is happening in a woman's psyche, explain to her some interconnections of what she feels and what is relevant for her, with what goes beyond the limits of her perception and understanding. This is again concretics in every particular case. Question 7. Is a man subordinate to a woman? Yes, he is subordinate to a woman if he is a slave of his instincts. If he aggresses from the power of his instincts and is not a demon or a zombie, but is really capable of love, then in most cases everything will be fine. But in any pairing relationship, there is always something that the person has to do for himself. If he doesn't do it himself, nothing will work. Because here is one such striking example of this. This is Judas. You see, we must admit that it's unlikely that Jesus was an ineffective teacher, an ineffective psychologist. He was extremely effective in both of these qualities. And in order for Judas not to become what he became, and not to do what he did, Judas for sure was given everything, but Judas did not do something himself. And what Jesus gave him, he did not find a use for it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the world is arranged in such a way that there is something that a person must do himself. He must want it himself. And if he himself does not want and does not do it, nothing will happen. And it depends overall only on himself. Question 8. Being a slave of women, Velichko definitely overstated, as if underthumbedness is good. This question is one of the most striking examples of how this person extracts from the words a meaning that was not put in them. I have never, nowhere, said that being henpecked, being under the thumb, is good. I've always said that being under the thumb is big trouble. First of all, for the family as a whole, where this takes place. But in the previous lecture, I spoke about the biological foundations of civilization. I spoke about some features of the structure of human organisms, about some features of human development, and everything was considered on the condition that the culture is at a 0 or close to 0 level of development. And a purely biological task is solved: the reproduction of a population of the biological species Homo sapiens. This task is solved in an automatic mode, that is, the individual is not aware of this, and as long as he is a carrier of the animal type of psyche structure, instincts will work automatically, and instincts will work for the task of reproducing generations of the biological species. Therefore, the female wants to be protected. It is pleasant for her. And in order for her child to grow up, the male must be subordinate to the female. It works in an automatic mode, and it is biologically purpose consonant in relation to the task of the reproduction of generations of the biological species Homo sapiens. Last time I did not touch on one more theme. This is the theme, the basis of the plot of the fairy tale Zolushka, the basis of the plot of the fairy tale Father Frost, and many other tales, on the theme of the stepmother and children of her husband from the first marriage. You see, in ancient times, when folk tales were formed, well, divorces were not accepted in most cultures. And if a man found himself alone with his children, without a spouse, then in most cases, the spouse simply died. The same goes for widows. Well, the world is arranged in such a way that the biological resource of the man's organism is less than the biological resource of the woman's organism. The instinctive algorithmics for the reproduction of the biological species is built in such a way that the mortality rate of men, directly under the impact of various kinds of tragic circumstances, and as a result of these tragic circumstances, after a while is also higher than the mortality rate of women. Therefore, there is also a certain number of widows. And so the widowed unite into a single family, and after that the stepmother begins to persecute the children of her husband, in essence, squeezing them out of the world. And the male spouse does not oppose this, since he is under his wife's thumb. If you want, you can agree or disagree with this, but in general, this is also biologically purpose consonant, in relation to the task of reproduction of generations of the biological species Homo sapiens in the absence of culture or at a low level of development of culture, when culture has not yet become human. What is the point in this behavior of the stepmother? The point is simple and twofold. First, if the mother of these children died, then most likely something was wrong with her health. That is, she was a carrier of some not very good genetics, and accordingly, in order to improve the gene pool, the stepmother automatically tries to squeeze the children from her husband's first marriage out of this world. The second variant for the implementation of this program. If, nonetheless, the children have a substantial potential for combat resistance and grow up, then they leave their ancestral home, and thanks to this, the biological species, its population, spreads beyond those limits where it did not exist before. That is, this function also takes place, and it is biologically purpose consonant in its own way. Although in relation to man, to the building of a system of not animal, but human relationships, the style of behavior of the stepmother is undoubtedly vicious, and in folktales it is condemned, since folktales express a certain ideal of life. But again, if the theme of under-the-thumb people and the consequences came up, for some reason our specialists in literature do not deal with the psychology of characters, and do not deal with comparative psychology, comparing the behavior of characters in different works. And in this case, sometimes very interesting things are revealed. Because if we read The Night Before Christmas by N.V. Gogol, then Oksana, under whose pressure Vakula harnessed the devil and flew on his back to St. Petersburg for the Tsarina's slippers, she arouses sympathy among many. And when the same people read The Storm by A.N. Ostrovsky, then Kabanicha causes a terrible antipathy among most people, and her son Tikhon is just a pathetic non-entity. And what is the connection between these works? A simple one. Oksana and Kabanicha are the same psychological type of woman, only in different periods of life. And if Vakula harnessed the devil, then after the marriage with Oksana, there are two variants. Either he will harness Oksana, or Oksana, having put him under her heel, will eventually crush him, become a widow, and her children will be such non-entities as Tikhon in The Storm, regardless of sex, be they boys or girls. Question 9. Is the so-called galactic night a kind of test of civilization, which it passes or collapses, or degrades greatly if the structure is inadequate, or if the destruction of civilization or degradation during this period is objective? You know, in my understanding, references to the galactic night as an objective factor of the impact of certain cosmic elements and forces on civilization are an excuse for people, in order not to do anything themselves. Let's see how people live in the Arctic Circle. There is a long, semi-annual polar day. There is a long, semi-annual polar night. Now if these peoples do nothing on a long, polar day, preparing for a long, polar night, then these peoples would long ago have disappeared from the face of the planet. But nonetheless, they live. And in terms of health, stability to interaction with the environment, personal psychological development, they actually turn out to be far times higher than the so-called highly civilized peoples, which degrade during the development of the technosphere, while preserving non-human types of psyche structure as a norm for society. Therefore, references to the galactic night, to the night of Svarog, are excuses on the theme of justifying one's own do-nothingness. Even if we assume that Svarog is asleep, then you are awake, and you need to maintain order, since a person, according to his predestination, is the successor of the Almighty on earth. Question 10. Does the current Western civilization have a way out, given the suppression of culture and its biology? If it is on its own, then its way out onto the path of development is possible only through the catastrophe of what they have built. If we consider global processes, then A.S. Khomyakov has a poem. It is called To Russia, written in 1839. Take pride, said the slavers enchanting, brow thine in white wreath adorned, land of steel adamantine, seized half the world with a sword. Thy preeminence knows no borders, and a slave to thy slightest mandate, fulfilling with pride every order, fate herself lies before thee prostrate. Red flowers do thy steps decorate, and thy mountains propped against the sky, and oh, but thy seas, oh, thy lakes, believe them not, heed them not, take not pride. Let the deep waves of thy rivers be as waves of the sea and seas. Let the bowels of thy mountains glimmer, and the fat of thy steppes lush with wheat. Let them bow for thy sovereign resplendence, the folk timidly lower their gaze, and with a tidal remembrance let the seas sing a choir in thy praise. Let them as a thunderstorm bloody, thy Peruns into yonderness fly. In all of this strength and this glory, in all of these ashes do not ever take pride. Great Rome was more dreadful than thee, king of the 7-hill throne, iron of force and savage of will, a dream that was pulled as a sword from a stone. Beyond bearing the fire of Bulat, when the wildlings of Altai aggressed, and she buried herself neath piles of gold, did the queen of the seas of the west. What of Rome, and where are the Mongols? And having hid in her breast a death moan, forges a mutiny strengthless, trembling o'er the abyss, Albion. Fruitless the spirit of pride. Steel is fragile and untrue as gold. But strong the clear world of the shrine. The hand of the prayer is the hand of the bold. And yes, for the fact thou art humble, that in the feeling of simplicity, in the hush of the heart innermost, God's word was accepted by thee. To you availed he his calling, to you his inheritance bright, to preserve for the world the great fortune of pure deeds and of high sacrifice, to house the tribes of the fellowship holy, life-giving vessel of love, and of riches of faith white and fiery, and the truth and judgment without blood. Yours is all which the Spirit holds sacred, wherein heaven is heard by the heart, wherein life's coming days lie latent, where from glory and miracles start. O remember thy predestination, resurrect in the heart days gone by, and in it converse thee and question the deep hidden spirit of life. Heed him, and every nation, embracing the love brought from thee, tell them the mystery of freedom, pour forth the radiance of truth of belief, and in glory thou shalt come miraculous, above all the suns of the globe, like this Sion vault of the heavens, translucent celestial robe. Actually, this poem is essentially a setting of the task of developing and implementing the Russian project of globalization. But the contemporaries did not comprehend this poem. However, during the days of State Emergency Committee, it was read on the radio. Therefore, if we implement the Russian project of globalization on the basis of the objective laws of all 6 groups, then those in the West and in the East who are not total idiots and who have at least the rudiments of will or remnants of will, they will agree with this project and carry it forward, developing themselves among their peoples. And therefore both Western civilization and not Western, other regional civilizations, have chances for the revival and formation of a culture of humanness. Question 11. Now such ideas are being instilled into the crowd that in any cosmic civilization the inner essence is the same. Everywhere there is financial speculation, slave trade, Star Wars between each other, and 500 more features of baboon behavior. Yes, it is really so. Why? Because the baboons who write scripts and make films, they express themselves. But trying to express themselves, they imagine that their bandalog essence rests on a much more powerful technosphere than what is now on the planet. This is where everything comes from. But again note that when The Hour of the Bull was written, in the Soviet Union its publications were discontinued, and for some time it was removed from libraries, and the attempt to film it by Stanley Kubrick was ceased. That is, this is a manifestation of the fact that certain forces of the present civilization are trying to keep the mode of baboonism and the reproduction of baboonism in the continuity of generations. Question 12. Are you familiar with the works of academician Kaznachev Vladimir Petrovich? What is your opinion? As always, we do not evaluate other people's works, and I'm not very familiar with the works of Kaznachev. Our position is that civilization first develops Pravius Nraviousness and ethics, and then develops Pravius physics, chemistry, and other branches of natural science, and uses them safely. In the meantime, the physics that exists and other branches of natural science are full of errors. They allow the current civilization, under the reign of baboonism, bandalogism, to smash the Earth, the solar system, and maybe more than one galaxy into small pieces. One more question about theory on the link. Once again, we adhere to the view that first the Pravius human psychology, Pravius Nraviousness and ethics, and then Pravius adequate physics and other branches of natural science. Question 13. There is a problem with the concept of matter, substance, in the framework of this theory. The conception of social safety does not go deeply into it, but matter is one of the pillars of the triunity. Could you take some time for this? I ask you to find a lecture on YouTube specifically dedicated to the triunity. In addition to my lecture, there is also a lecture by Vladimir Mikhailovich on this theme. Think for yourself, ponder on it, draw some sketches while reading, Google some things, read the text of the conception of social safety dedicated to the triunity. Question 14. You stuff people with stories about Pravius life, and we are actually being genocided. All this chatting will lead to the fact that there will be no one to watch your lectures. Everyone who could do something but was enslaved by reading the thick books of the conception will die out. I have a simple counter question. What do you suggest? Let's simply turn to the historical process. Now you came to the fact that we are being genocided. Yes, we are being genocided. And when there was the 20th Congress of the CPSU party, and when the prerequisites for this genocide were laid, was anyone opposed? And of those who were opposed, there were also such people, but there were few of them, did any of them take actions in order to extinguish this future genocide? No, that was not the case. Let's go further in history. When the so-called Brezhnev's constitution was adopted, the following terminological change was made in it. In Stalin's constitution of 1936, the people had to exercise their power through the Soviets of Working People's Deputies. That is, deputies were not supposed to be parasites and representatives of parasitic estates. But those who wanted the restoration of the system of parasitism in the country, there were such people in the society, they were part of the people. And when the Soviet of Working People's Deputies were replaced in the constitution by Soviets of People's Deputies, in fact, through these words, the possibility was opened up for parasites and deputies from parasites to be included in the government bodies. Did anyone understand this at that time? Did anyone object? Next, when in 1987, Yeltsin began to openly publicly oppose Gorbachev's activities, how did people react to this? A charismatic person, he tells the truth, they said. Who understood that he was a hypocrite, an opportunist, who himself could not do anything and did not want to learn? Further, when Saji Umalatova and V.D. Bludov, Saji at the Congress of Deputies of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and Bludov at the 29th Congress of the CPSU, demanded that Gorbachev be held accountable for treason, who supported them? Therefore, those who in past times chose for themselves the fate of grass on the battlefield, they have no moral right to say that they are being genocided. In fact, by and large, our bodies are not intended for eternal life. Our planet will not exist forever. The Quran directly states that even the universe is created for a period of time, proceeding from a certain higher meaning, which not everyone here understands. That is, the task is to personally develop here, but not to luxuriate. Well, when Brezhnev's constitution was adopted, the bulk of the people were worried that there were no 200 sorts of sausages in stores, that there were no branded jeans, there were problems with buying a foreign car, Western music was not available to us, its records were in short supply. Now, in shops, there is an abundance of different sorts of sausages, jeans, whatever foreign cars you want, only the domestic industry is dead for some reason. After all, the people got everything they wanted. Well, and genocide, in addition to this. The thing is, history develops on the basis of cause-effect relationships, and therefore, if you look at the process from the standpoint of eternity, then yes, someone is falling victim to genocide. From the point of view of atheists, this happens in such a way meaninglessly and causelessly. From the point of view of the religious worldview, it happens because people themselves fell very deep into God's allowance. And since we fell into allowance, some element and social forces are committing genocide, mowing down those unsuitable for further development. If you don't want to fall victim to genocide, then previously conceive children, raise them previously, read the thick books yourselves, teach your children to read the thick books. The Almighty is aware of what is going on the earth, and He never eradicates previousness and striving for previousness. Therefore, solve your problems yourselves, and pay attention to such an episode in the Russian epic Spilinas. There is such a plot where Ilya Muromets frees the captives. Please note that there is quite a big number of captives. Not all of them are children, women, and old people. The question is why the men did not organize themselves and did not eliminate the overwatchers and others in order to free everyone. And here the same thing, the psychological attitude towards the problem of genocide, towards the problem of oppression, towards the problem of reproduction of the slave system in different forms. It has not changed. Everyone wants someone to come and set them free. When Yeltsin died, V. Zhirinovsky said that he had given us freedom. He did not give anyone freedom, because a person develops freedom in himself. and no one else can give freedom to him if he is psychologically a slave and does nothing in life. Question 15. Tell me first, where does the elite begin and where the crowd, so that we can talk about a non-crowd elite society? To begin with, let's say that this theme was set out in the materials of the conception of social safety long ago. And my lectures, all sorts of other lectures, they are not so much to tell people something, but to induce people to read thick books and think for themselves. He who does not want to read thick books, this is his right. Think for yourselves. Work out a previous world understanding faster than you can read the thick books. But as for this question, everything is simple here. The elites are the same crowd, only more informed, armed with different knowledge and skills that make them more capable than ordinary people. And along with this, if we correlate with the typology of characters by P. Leerskaft, the elite is a different statistic of distribution, according to the psychological types by Leerskaft, than among ordinary people. And this is not the best distribution according to the psychological types. In Russia, the elite has always been distinguished by conceit and exclusive filthiness, which was not found among ordinary people. But ordinary people, they are what they are. Again, read Leerskaft. Everything is interconnected here. Further, those who do not want to read thick books, there is another variant. Relax, tune yourselves in, and take within a few seconds from the noosphere all the worldly life wisdom of civilization beyond what is written in the thick books. What will happen if you do this? On your defective nraviousness, on your prejudices, something will crash down that you will not withstand, both the wisdom of the past and future centuries. It will simply crush you and destroy you. This is one of the manifestations of the following principle. It would have been nice to be in paradise, but many a sin doesn't let me in. Not everyone remembers this proverb, but it really expresses the keys to worldly life wisdom. If we engage in its synonymous formation, then everyone remembers approximately the first half of it. I want to live well. But the fact that one's own sinfulness and the sinfulness of society as a whole does not allow living well is not considered. And when this circumstance is pointed out, then a well-known excuse appears according to one of the films of the 1990s. We are not like that, but life is like that. No, guys, life is like that because you are like that. Further on, there is another question which says the following. Who admits that he is a parasite? This is an abstraction. The crowd is also an abstraction. No, parasitism is parasitism. If you do not turn a blind eye, it is visible in life. And is visible in life not only in the behavior of others, but also in one's own behavior. Read the book by F. Chuyev named Molotov, the Half-Power Lord. Here are conversations with V. Molotov. In one of the conversations, he honestly admits, we began to luxuriate. That is, we, the former revolutionaries, began to parasitize on society, became exploiters. This is not an abstraction. Everything is clear, honestly said. But why did they begin to luxuriate? Why did they not stop luxuriating when they had begun? The question says that the crowd is also an abstraction, but characteristics of the crowd are defined by V.G. Bielinski. A crowd is a collection of people who live according to legend and tradition, and who reason according to authority. This can be seen in the behavior of others. This can be seen in one's own behavior. Well, if not in the process of activity, then recalling one's own behavior in the past. So, many questions are not according to the essence. The following is a comment to the lecture. Well, there is such an objection. Russian Tajiks will help. Russian civilization, but without Russians. This is the real objective of the lectures. Congratulations. Well, the last phrase is, this is irony on the theme that one of the listeners, instead of trying to master the materials of the lecture, the materials of the conception, is trying to express his primitivism through the vocabulary of the conception, through his rejection of the conception. On that we finish with the questions. Now let's move on to highlight the problematics of the course, Biospheric Social Economic System as an Object of Governance. The previous lecture was dedicated to biological fundamentals. In the main, it was some features of the structure of the organism, some features of development and informational algorithmic support in the form of instinctive programs of behavior, which are distributed among the representatives of both sexes of the biological species Homo sapiens. In fact, everything except our leadership, in terms of the ratio of the volume or the brain mass of an adult to the volume or to the brain mass of a newborn, all the rest is characteristic of all other biological species. There are instincts, there is a division into two sexes in the majority, some biological species are hermaphrodites, but man carries culture. What is culture? The answers to this question are different in different traditions. Some insist that this is the cult of Ra, that is, the cult of the god Ra. Well, what if there is another cult, but not Ra? Is this culture or not? There are those who believe that culture is a kind of high spirituality. Again, what is spirituality? What is non-spirituality? What is the difference between high spirituality and low spirituality? Is there negative spirituality? How and by what unit of measurement can we measure the height of spirituality? This non-understanding of culture is the consequence of the fact that the humanitarian sciences are not a continuation of the natural sciences. And moreover, in the I-centric worldview and world understanding, in which the ultimate generalizations of space and time, as empty receptacles of the material creation, permeated by spirit, in this I-centric worldview, there is no meaningful answer as to what culture is, what the psyche of man is, how they are connected with each other, how the psyche is connected with human biology, how culture is connected with human biology. In the I-centric worldview, there can be no adequate answers to these questions in principle. Yes, there can be all sorts of conversations on these themes. There can be systems of buoying problems and solutions of problems. What is buoying? It is like in navigation. We do not see what is hidden under the water. There are landmarks that are placed and some buoys are left by the boatmaster on the starboard side, others on the port side. He should direct the vessel along some landmarking buoys, leaving them to the north, some leaving them to the south, east or west. But what is under the water, he does not see. Well, if there was the opportunity to see the bottom topography, the way a pilot sees it in clear weather, then there would be no need to buoy any navigational hazards. To see the relief of the bottom, figuratively speaking, allows the transition to a world understanding on the basis of the ultimate generalizations or primary differences, which in the conception of social safety are called the triunity of matter, information, measure. Proceeding from such a world understanding, one can see that instincts are an informational algorithmic system in a certain way for certain tasks related to the survivability of the species, its spread, distributed among the representatives of every population according to representatives of the sexes. One can see that the psyche of man is also an informational algorithmic system, the emergence of which, the path of development, the potential of which is genetically determined. And if you look at culture from the standpoint of the world understanding of the triunity of matter, information, measure, then culture also appears as an informational algorithmic system. The very fact of the emergence of culture is genetically programmed for the biological species Homo sapiens. But in this understanding, culture is not a certain species-specific characteristic of man. There are publications that say that zoologists at Duke University in the US studied orangutan populations in Africa and found that different populations differ in some behavioral characteristics that are passed from generation to generation and are mastered by representatives of new generations based on the fact that they communicate with adults. Zoologists were surprised by this fact, since the conclusions from this fact are the following. Orangutans are also a cultural species. They carry a certain culture, which is passed on in addition to the genetic mechanism of the biological species from one generation to the other. And if we look at the system of interrelationships between biology, culture, individual psyche, from the standpoint of the triunity, then instincts and unconditioned reflexes are a biological, innate component. The potential of personal psychic development is also an innate component, and the potential of ours is not the same as the one of the orangutans. And further, since there is a potential for personal development, and it includes intellect and the fruits of intellectual activity, then culture appears as a complex set of knowledge and skills that are passed from generation to generation in addition to the genetic mechanism of the biological species Homo sapiens. This is the definition of culture in the conception of social safety. Culture is all information and algorithmics, that is, knowledge and skills, that are passed from generation to generation in addition to the genetic mechanism of the biological species. And with this understanding, Homo sapiens and orangutans are indeed both cultural species. But the cultures that each of them carry are different, both in their potentials of development and in the amount of information and algorithmics that can be embedded in their cultures. But every individual is also a carrier of some part of the culture, precisely as an informational algorithmic system. A part of this information and algorithmics is localized in the individual psyche. Other parts are localized in the individual psyche of other people. But since our organism is not only a substantial body, it is also certain biofields, then some part of culture is recorded on an information carrier, a biofield of the biological species Homo sapiens. There is memory, there are ideals, that which is directed into the future. And even if we do not realize all of this, then both our genetics and our belonging to a certain culture, they provide access to these masses of information and algorithmics through our psyche, since the keys to this are in some way recorded in our genetics and in the results of how we master and develop culture. Culture is connected with biology. How is it connected? In fact, the genetic mechanism of any biological species, and of man, is also an instrument of adaptation to the external environment. But if this is an instrument of adaptation, then questions arise on the parameters of its performance speed. The genetic mechanism cannot adapt a biological species to changes of the external environment faster than the new generations enter into life. That is, its performance speed is limited, and it reacts to slow-flowing changes. Moreover, historians note that apparently it reacts preemptively, because one of the harbingers of wars in the historical past was a violation of the proportion of girls and boys born in families. Before wars, more boys than girls were born, although under normal conditions slightly more girls are born than boys. Infant mortality among boys is higher, and girls turn out to be superfluous in relation to the number of boys. That is, the genetic mechanism really works. It really reacts both to the ongoing changes in the external environment and to the upcoming changes. Now look at the other side of the question. The culture is carried by the biological species, this or that population, which historians, sociologists usually call a people, a culturally peculiar society. There exists what is called the tradition of culture. A violation of cultural traditions is suppressed by society itself. Well, if culture in some aspects is stable throughout the life of many generations, this means that culture is an environmental factor which also adapts to the genetic mechanism of the biological species. And the fact that it adapts poses the question, what changes in culture are purpose consonant so that they somehow affect genetics and improve vital capacity, the potential of man's capability, and what changes in culture and what traditions need to be eradicated in order for them not to prevent man from further development and not to support the processes of biological degradation of man. But due to the fact that biology, sociology, and political science are torn apart in traditional culture, these questions do not even arise. But if you look at them, these are very life-important and relevant questions to which the named sciences, biology, sociology, and political science, must provide answers, life-consistent answers. And, in accordance with these answers, both state politics and social self-governance must be built, as well as the functioning of every one of the social institutions that have historically formed in the culture of society. But this theme, unfortunately, is closed for discussion, and if the hosts of TV shows are offered to discuss this theme, then it is not even necessary to prohibit these discussions. This goes so far beyond the world understanding of our journalistic core that they will not even understand what it is all about. And this circumstance puts us before the question of building a typology of cultures. Many typologies of cultures can be built. The features that form the basis of the typology can also be different. Recall the Soviet film Kin Za Za. A typology of cultures based on the color differentiation of pants is proposed, a characteristic feature. What does this give for understanding the life of society? Nothing. This episode from Kinzadza is grotesque. But if you turn to our textbooks on culturology, then in fact you will see the same thing there. Not the color differentiation of pants, something else, but also something that doesn't characterize culture precisely in the aspect of its interconnection and conditionality with the objective laws of all 6 groups. And the typologies on the basis of which a society can really analyze its state, analyze the perspective if it does not change its state, its quality, consider variance for the future, are conditioned by how society will change itself. Actually, all this should lie at the basis of the typology of culture. But in order to understand this typology of cultures, one must understand what is a taken place human, what is a non-taken place person, what is a degrading person. How should the interaction of the individual in society be organized in order for society to be in harmony with nature, including the harmony of civilization and the biosphere? So depending on the answer to the question, what is a taken place human, you will get this or that typology of cultures. If you do not think of these questions at all, then you will reduce the typology of cultures to the fact that in Ukraine, everything is based on borscht and salo with vodka, and in Uzbekistan there is pilaf, pomegranates grow there, people walk in wadded robes in the heat, and that it isn't so hot in the sun. Well, what are the perspectives? Do borscht and salo somehow explain the tragedy that has been happening in Ukraine for more than 20 years? No. Even if we assume that there are some deep connections between salo and mentality, then we should say that there are cultures where pork is simply prohibited. Nonetheless, there is a tragedy similar to the one in Ukraine, and sometimes even in a more severe form. An example of this is Libya. Therefore, if we talk about the typology of cultures, then we must start with what is a taken place human. The fact of birth in the biological species of Homo sapiens is not enough to take place as a human. Not enough for the simple reason that a life-incapable baby is born. Yes, he carries the genetic program for the development of the organism and the psyche of the individual, but this program is not autonomous. It works in an interactive mode. That is, in the interaction of the organism and the psyche, which is carried by the organism, and the environment habitat in which the child is located, in which he grows up. And the nature of this interaction predetermines what results will have shown up by the time the genetic program for the development of the organism and psyche is completed. There is an anecdote tale. Well, there was a biologist, academician T.D. Lysenko. An extremely negative attitude has been created towards him in the officialdom of modern science, and an extremely negative attitude in peri-scientific publicism. I recommend that you read the book by Yuri Ignatyevich Mukhin, The Corrupt Girl Genetics. Find the works of T.D. Lysenko and see what they say, and how it relates to life and the subsequent development of biological science. So there was an anecdote. Lysenko was once asked the question, why, despite the fact that circumcision has existed in many cultures for millennia, does genetics not adapt to it, and babies are born uncircumcised? Lysenko allegedly did not answer this question. The answer to this question is that there is a certain standard that is kept by the noosphere of the planet. This standard allows for variations that can be genetically fixed in the offspring. And there is something that the standard does not allow. Because if this is allowed, then the genetic potential for the development of the species will be significantly lower. Therefore, the question itself, in spite of all its seemingly outward ingenuity, is a foolish question. But since even the noosphere of the planet is not the highest level of organization of governance in the universe, and that which is supposed to be, it is quite difficult to evade, since allowance for evasion is not without boundaries. So man is supposed to be biologically healthy, and on the basis of this biological health, he must develop full-fledgedly, operating the genetic program of development. If we talk about what result there should be, that is, by the time the genetic program is completed, then the result should be what is said in the conception of social safety repeatedly. A taken place human. This is a will, realizing cognitive creative potential under the power of the dictatorship of Sovest. Will is understood as the ability to subjugate oneself and the course of events around to consciously perceived purpose consonance. Consciously perceived purpose consonance is worked out by the creative potential that is given to man, and it is worked out in the process of mastering and developing creative potential. Sovest is an innate religious sense. To put it differently, the conception of social safety does not presuppose the fact that the atheistic worldview and world understanding are adequate. But since God does not violate anyone, even with the truth, then being an atheist is the right of man. But this right is not limited in time, and, moreover, it carries accompanying circumstances, in the form of the need to disentangle the consequences of an atheistic worldview, both in one's own life and in the life of society. So if we define a human as an individual whose will realizes his creative potential under the dictatorship of Sovest, then these three attributes should lie at the basis of the typology of cultures. In other words, cultures differ in how each of them relates to three things: creative potential of man, will of man, and Sovest of man. And if again you look at life, at cause-effect relationships, then the order of priority, it is like this: creativity, will, Sovest. Why? Because if man lives, then only creativity, power of intellect, and personal culture of senses as components of his creative potential, they enable him to come to the conclusion that something in his life and in the life of society is not the way it should be. So, if this conclusion that something is wrong is made, then further conclusions that one must live according to Sovest are inevitable. And in order to live according to Sovest, such a factor as will is also necessary. A conscious comprehension of will, in fact, also takes place as a result of cognitive creative activity. And Sovest and will are comprehended as factors of life almost simultaneously if man ponders that something is wrong in life, especially since in the culture there is a lot on the theme of Sovest and will. But in order to live according to Sovest, will is required, which subjugates creative potential to the dictatorship of Sovest. Therefore, the typologies of cultures are really built on these three characteristic attributes, precisely in this sequence: relation to creative potential, relation to will, relation to Sovest. I use the word relation. The word relation usually presupposes the presence of subjectness, but culture does not possess such an indivisible, individual, personal subjectness. Therefore, the word relation should be understood in the mathematical sense, as the relation of one object to another, as an informational algorithmic relation. Culture, as an informational algorithmic system, carries in itself some standards of relations that are characteristic of this or that society to many life phenomena. Various phenomena, natural ones such as rain, snow, weather in general, climate, social relations, dad, mom, children, other people, social institutions that exist in society, the economy, its parameters. Well, in this sense, the relations towards these three named characteristics also exist, and culture can vary. Different cultures differ from each other in the relation of the personality towards the three named attributes. There are cultures that are indifferent to creative potential. That is, if you want it, you can master it. You can realize it somehow. No one will say anything bad to you about this. But no one will support, praise, or encourage you either. This is your creative potential. Your relationship to it is your personal matter, which does not concern us. There are cultures in which the right to open creative potential is not recognized for everyone. Recall the Soviet movie, An Unfinished Piece for a Mechanical Piano. When an ordinary person plays a mechanical piano, starts pounding on the keys, and the piano, due to its mechanical nature, naturally plays some kind of melody. And the aristocrat, looking at this with eyes bulging from surprise, says the phrase, "The grimy one cannot." This is an expression of the fact that the right to creative potential in this society is recognized only for the elite. All others should not have creative potential. Or if the crowd elitism is multi-leveled, then at the lower levels, creative potential should not be mastered at all. Or some narrow directions are allowable, and at the highest levels, creative potential must be mastered. If you turn to history, then the activity of the SS and Hitlerism in general, it was aimed at raising, forming a kind of super elite, which would have a much more powerful creative potential than the rest of the racially inferior, and would surpass them in capabilities. Is this good or bad? If you correlate with what I said last time, then these are only cultural superstructures over the instincts of herd pack behavior in the aspect of building a hierarchy within the herd pack. Moreover, this task itself contradicts biology in some way. Why? Because the leader in the herd pack, he is not necessarily the most, and superior to all other specimens in all respects, because in the biosphere, the first feature that characterizes the one who becomes the leader is the speed of reaction to some events in life, the speed of reaction to the threat. The fastest reaction, by virtue of the peculiarities of the human psyche, who has intellectual power, sensitivity, everyone has all that, although there is also statistics, but statistics is localized in a rather narrow range of parameters of performance speed. The fastest reaction is the most primitive. This reaction is good because it is the fastest. It may be far from optimal, but it's the fastest. And it enables one to solve certain tasks with acceptable damage. But the working out of a better solution would require more time, and the implementation of this better solution could be belated in relation to the dynamics of the development of the situation. Due to these circumstances, the task of Hitlerism, to develop a kind of superhuman race, and in the form in which it was undertaken, it contradicted both the social objective laws of a culturological character and the biological objective laws of building an internal hierarchy in the pack on a global scale, although it flowed from this algorithmics. There is such a thing that in history is called liberalism. Declaratively, it seems like creative potential should be mastered. Well, perhaps the most active cry on this theme is the work of Alice Rosenbaum, under the pseudonym Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, a collection of apology of egoism, and there are other works of hers. But again, look, with all the hymns to the creative potential and creativity of people, society is polarized towards creators and cattle. The cattle should be grateful to their creators, and according to the leftover principle, be content with what the creators give. At the same time, Elise somehow does not pay attention to the fact that creators themselves cannot replace. Creators of ideas, creators of technological, governorial, and other solutions, they cannot replace all the personnel who work to incarnate these ideas into reality. And if powerful technologies, powerful objects of technology fall into the hands of the personnel, who are really not far from the bestial psyche, then the result is what goes into the aphorism, monkey with a grenade. And such a relation towards creative potential, when the right to creative potential, its realization, is recognized for far from all members of society, not for all children, this is deadly. But again, liberalism tends to gloss over this problem, because pointing out the faults of others is wrong from the liberal point of view. And from the point of view of liberalism, the idiot is called alternatively gifted. Yes, in some respects he is indeed alternatively gifted, but to pretend that the problem of the relation towards the creative potential of people, towards creative potential of society as a whole, in society does not exist, this is very wrong. And in the long run, it is suicidal for civilization. 100 years ago, the Great October Socialist Revolution took place, which the liberals condemn as a mistake of history. If you read the works of V.I. Lenin, read the works of J.V. Stalin, it turns out that in relation to creative potential, the task of this revolution was such that every child born in the society would receive a worthy education, which would not tie him to any one of the professions, that in order to become a communist, one had to know history, be a widely erudite person, be a creator of the future. In other words, in relation to creative potential, the task was set so that the creative potential of every personality was a social property, the property of the whole people. And accordingly, every person had to master and develop his creative potential, the potential of his children. And any action aimed at suppressing the creative potential to its perversion, oppression, although this was not set forth in the country's criminal code, nonetheless, if we correlate with the ideals proclaimed by V.I. Lenin and J.V. Stalin, is a crime against the entire people, equivalent to high treason. Therefore, the ideologies and creators of the reform of the education system, which was carried out in the 1990s, if we correlate with these ideals, are bastards, fascists, rare scum. Because indeed, if the creative potential of every person is a social property, then its realization enables one to detect and resolve many problems, provided that with the other two attributes that form the foundation of the typology of cultures, everything is also normal. Well, imagine such a situation that the creative potential is realized. New knowledge, new technologies, new psychological practices of some kind appear, and the one who creates gives out all of this, and he has no will. That is, he is not able to subjugate himself on his own initiative to any meaningfully comprehended by him purpose consonants. In the ultimate variant, it is a kind of encyclopedia embodied in the human organism. That is, he himself is nothingness. But if you come to him, ask a question like, "Listen, I have such a question," he will give a complete answer. But if next to him there occurs a catastrophe, which he is able to prevent because he has the necessary knowledge and skills, or he can work them out at the pace of development of this catastrophe, or preempting its onset, he will not do anything, and the catastrophe will break out. And in the Russian language, there was a very clear division: rab, a slave, and nivolnik, the one with no will. But a rab, originally this is not a nivolnik. He was not the property of another person, but a rab of God, a worker of God on earth. Initially, there was nothing humiliating, defaming the individual in this concept. Man, in essence, cannot be human if he evades religiosity, although atheists have a different opinion on this matter. And if you look at history, then societies, they are also different, because that which is called totalitarianism, that is, when only the supreme dictator has the right to will, all the others are either nivolniks, or their will should be subordinated to the will of the supreme dictator. In the last 20 years, at least, or even 30, there have been a lot of people who like to draw parallels between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, insisting that Stalin and Hitler are birds of a feather. There were such caricatures in the 1930s, even during their lifetime, well, of the type that Stalin is the bride, Hitler is the groom, and now they're ambling somewhere arm in arm. Well, now look, there is a film by Leni Riefenstahl. It is called Triumph of the Will, and the film is dedicated to the Nazi Party Congress which took place in Nuremberg, if I'm not mistaken, in 1934. Well, if we understand the psychology of personality, then the correct title of the film is The Apotheosis of Willlessness, because the crowd subordinated its will to the Führer, and the Führer, with closer consideration, was simply possessed. That is, he was also not the owner of his will, if he had any will. So the film on the theme that the will of the Führer leads the people is one thing, but the reality, the Führer and the people, is completely different. And the problem is precisely that on top there appears a willless person. Someone manipulates him according to his own will. All loyal systems subordinate their will or willlessness to the Führer. Those who disagree with this, they are not right, subject to re-upbringing in concentration camps or destruction as defective. Therefore, the question of will is also an important question that characterizes the life of society. And the question is not about the will of the first person of the state, but the question of the will of each and every one in the state, starting from children who master their will, and ending with old people who are engaged in fussing with their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and passing something from themselves to them, both in their stories and in games, and most importantly, at the level of biofield communication. Then the question of will, that there should be no nivolniks in society, is really one of the most important questions. We live in a culture where the question of will is understood as the insolvability of the paradox, I do what I want, my way or the highway. But if everyone does what he wants, will there be any conflicts arising between these very particular wills, which must in some way be settled? If you need to settle conflicts, then another liberal nonsense appears on the theme that your freedom ends where the freedom of another begins. And where does the freedom of one end and the freedom of another begin? So this phrase, your freedom ends where the freedom of another begins, is analogous to the well-known phrase, from Odessa Stories by I.E. Bubble, where one asks, where do the police end and Benya Krik the gangster begin? And to which smart people reply that where Benya Krik ends, there the police begins. Well, and where is the border between the police and Benya Krik? And the border, it dynamically moves from the police to Benya Krik, and again, due to a number of circumstances, the police turns out to be less capable than Benya Krik. But we will turn to these circumstances in one of the subsequent conversations. Now look, if there is a word liberty, which in English means freedom, and we live in Russia, our dominant, most widespread language is Russian. In Russian there is the word svoboda, then the question arises, why do we have the word liberal instead of freedom lover? Why is the Russian word, svoboda-lyubets, freedom lover, not used, but the word liberal is used? Well, this question is one of the questions connected with the mysticism of the language precisely as a means of governance towards matrix-egregorial processes. And I will start to answer this question from afar. You have seen the newsreels of the times of the Great Patriotic War. In most cases, the truck of the Katyusha rocket launcher in newsreels is the American three-axle vehicle Studebaker. Well, the Studebaker was not very widely used in the United States, but we must pay tribute that this truck and the Studebaker Company made a significant contribution to ensuring the victory of the Soviet Union in the Great Patriotic War, as a transport truck, as an artillery truck, and the carrier of the Katyusha multiple launch rocket system. The Studebaker Company ceased to exist, if I'm not mistaken, in 1966, but there was an interesting episode in its story. In 1956, they showed a concept car. The concept car was called the Predictor. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, I told you what a predictor-corrector scheme of governance is. And there is reason to believe that the psychodynamics of the American society reacted to the fact that the car was named Predictor by the fact that 10 years later, the company collapsed. If the car had been named somehow differently, but not Predictor, then it is possible that the company Studebaker would exist today. This is all about the fact that words are, as M. Gorky said, clothes in which thoughts appear. Meanings appear in a package of words. The name predictor touched on the unacceptable meanings for the American crowd elite culture, and so that these meanings were not touched upon, the company was punished. But it's possible that this is not the intrigues of brothers Masons, but simply an automatic reaction of American culture, the psychodynamics of their society as an informational algorithmic system that protected itself from the penetration of meanings alien to it. And now let's turn to what a liberal and a freedom lover are. The structure of the Russian language is such that the word svoboda, freedom, is an abbreviation of given by God, guidance by Sovest. Yes, someone may say that this is all nonsense, that we have the right to write in any text that black means white and white means black, and in the whole subsequent text, this is how the meaning should be perceived. But life is arranged in such a way that in some texts, such things are acceptable, and in some texts, such things are unacceptable. That is, you can make up any identifier of a certain meaning as a sequence of symbols, as a sequence of sounds, and use it, and nothing will happen. Or you can call a pot something that is not a pot, and as a result, one day it will be shoved into the oven. Contrary to the saying, you may call me a pot, just don't put me in the oven, and there will be big troubles. So if svoboda, freedom, is de facto a designation of the meaning given by God, guidance by Sovest, and Sovest is an innate religious sense, then the appearance of the word liberalism in the Russian language is aggression against Russian culture, aggression of liberalism as Sovestlessness, and only freedom lovers can resist the liberals. And further, the typology is enclosed. If you live according to your Sovest, then you need to master the creative potential. If you master the creative potential, then you need to master will and subjugate it to Sovest. If you live according to Sovest, and Sovest is really an innate religious sense, then the creative potential under the dictatorship of the Sovest of different people will interact in a mutually supplementary way with each other in the life of society, and there will never be such situations in which the will of one, acting in the mode of I do what I want, my way or the highway, will come into conflict with the will of another person, who also acts in the mode I do what I want, my way or the highway. Because these wants, they stem from Sovest that realizes the creative potential, and they initially, in the stream with the Almightiness, will be built in such a way that the wills mutually supplement and support each other without any conflicts. This is called sobornost in Russian. But the typology of cultures, based on these three features, relation to creativity, relation to will, relation to Sovest, and accordingly to shame, this is really a typology that enables one to diagnose the vices of any cultures that exist, to work out previous ideals of development of cultures, and to previously build step-by-step politics for the implementation of these ideals. That's it for today. Thank you for your attention. All of the best.